Welcome everyone to Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's virtual conversations. I'm Haney Lopez, a professor at UC Berkeley, and I will be the moderator for what will be a lively and incredibly timely conversation entitled Voting at Home. Joining me are Amber McReynolds, CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute and Coalition, and the co-author of When Women Vote, and also Jesse Wegman of the New York Times editorial board, where he often writes on voting at home, and he's also the author of Let the People Pick the President. So we're going to jump right in with Amber, and I'm going to ask her to make the case for why more people should be able to vote for home and why it's particularly necessary now.
Well, hello, and thank you for having me. I think first and foremost, as we've all seen, the public health crisis that we're all facing has really upended many aspects of our lives, and in particular, it's exposed some of the significant vulnerabilities in the in-person voting structure that many states still rely on. In the western half of the United States, we've significantly expanded vote by mail options and voting at home options over the last 20 years or so, and most of the states offer some form of it, and even close to 70% of voters in Western states cast their ballot using a mail ballot in the 2018 election. So there's precedent in many Western states. That's not the case in many parts of the country. And so what our organization has been working on over the last couple years is to expand and improve those voting at home systems across the country and in various regions around the country that haven't traditionally had a lot of voting at home. And the pandemic has really forced this issue to the forefront of the conversation about election reforms. Our initial goal was to push it in terms of convenience and providing more opportunities, but it's also now becoming a way for voters to engage without exposing themselves to unsafe conditions that might exist in an in-person voting process. So, our entire goal here is to really make sure that the voting process is safe, secure, accessible, and equitable for all voters. And, we believe that the voting at home system is one way to do that.
That's super interesting. You're really framing this sort of in a public health way. But I suspect a lot of people at home are wondering, is this really a situation in which the main issue is whether or not this is a healthier way to vote? Is that the thing you need to convince people of? Hey, that this would be healthier than in-person voting?
Well, I think the issue is it's really about change. So this is a different way of voting than what many states that are what I would call in the Midwest to Eastern region. It's different than what many people have voted that way, and so given that is a change, it's really about convincing people that they can be confident in that new type of method of voting, building procedures and processes that are secure and actually enhance security and make the process more convenient, while still encouraging participation, still keeping turnout and engagement where it should be. And what's interesting, I think, is when you look at vote by mail systems that have dominated in Western states, mostly those states all rank in the top 7 states every single time for turnout. Colorado, being where I'm from and where I helped design the system there, was the second highest turnout in the country in 2018, even without a competitive Senate race on the ballot. And that you look at that across the board, that's rare. Most of the states in that top tier of turnout had competitive Senate races, like Minnesota. So the fact that Colorado can be in that top echelon and have congressional districts that had 85% active turnout in some places, which is more than double what a lot of states saw in terms of midterm turnout, is significant and indicative of the voting by mail model, in that it encourages participation, empowers voters with options and time, and the ability to research issues and candidates at home. And then now it's become a solution in a public health crisis.
So I want to get Jesse in, but before I do, Amber, you quickly mentioned your own professional background. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? What were you doing? What got you into this issue?
Sure. Sure. Right now I'm the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute, but prior I actually was an election official. So I was the director of elections for Denver for 7 years and ran elections in the city and county of Denver for 14 years. A lot of people will describe me as a surgeon when it comes to voting, and that I know every aspect of the process, can fix and help to create solutions to many issues that come up in the voting process. And so that expertise has really given me an ability not only to write a book about how to reform our election systems, but also help now with my work at the National Vote at Home Institute in helping other states really expand this method of voting.
Great. Jesse, you want to come in? I know that you're writing about this. I take it you're writing about it favorably. I think, Amber's saying, well, here are the arguments for it. You want to amplify that? Anything you want to emphasize?
Sure. I think if we pull back a little and we can, look at the story of voting in America from the founding until today, and it's really a story of it's an arc that begins with exclusion and slowly leads to inclusion. Obviously, at the founding, virtually no one could vote. Only property-owning white males. Black people, women, Native Americans, poorer whites. Nobody was included, right? And so, even though we have these grand ideals of equality and representative democracy, we don't actually operate in that way. And slowly, over the course of history, those democratic ideals have won out time and again, from the removal of property qualifications, the enfranchisement of blacks, the enfranchisement of women, direct voting for senators, the enfranchisement of 18-year-olds. So all of that we see moving in the right direction. And so, in my book, which is about the Electoral College, I write about a national popular vote for president being the next great step on that path toward a broader and more representative democracy. But I think vote by mail is also just a great example of how you can make voting easier and more accessible and more more equal in a nation where there are a lot of people who struggle to get to the polls, even in non-pandemic circumstances. So the elderly obviously have been voting from home wherever they can in many cases and in many states, because it's just easier. It's hard to stand in line sometimes for hours. Sometimes it's dangerous to go to the polls if you're immunocompromised. And then there's people who maybe can't take the time off work, and there's all these different reasons that people can and should vote by mail, vote remotely. And we're just it's being shoved in our faces right now by the crisis that we're in. But I just can't think of a more obvious solution to this kind of a problem. The moment that the pandemic hit in this country, I think it just seemed like the most obvious thing in the world to say, oh, of course we need to make voting by mail as broadly accessible as possible. So I'm thrilled that Amber is doing the work she's doing, and that this is taking shape in the way that it is.
So let me ask you, it's a no-brainer. Our historical arc is taking us there. What do you think are the realistic chances this will be implemented before the 2020 election?
I mean, I'll leave it to Amber to answer the more concrete, process-related questions.
I want you to answer. What do you think are the realistic possibilities for this to be enacted nationally?
Well, when you say enacted nationally, are you saying will Congress pass a law?
Well, that would be ideal. But will states do this?
Okay, so obviously,
will Congress pass a law providing the funding that would allow states to do this? I mean, what are the realistic chances of its prospects today?
I guess I would throw that back at you and say, what's the alternative? We have to ramp up quickly. States that don't already have voting by mail infrastructure in place need to get that in place. They need the money to do that, and obviously that's money that needs to come from Congress. Congress has allocated so far a fraction of the amount that I think most experts have estimated that the states will need to do this in time. But yeah, we're on an extremely accelerated time schedule here. States that Amber talked about in the West that have really well-established mail voting protocols now have been doing this for years. It took them years to get here. And at that time, we don't have that time right now. So to the extent possible, I think states are going to need the money, and then they're going to need the political will to get it done right away. I think we are going to see it. There's, several dozen states already have no excuse absentee balloting, which is effectively vote by mail available statewide. The issue is just printing enough ballots in time, sending them out, getting them back, and having the staff to count them and to process them.
Let me ask the same question then of Amber. What do you think? What are the arguments for it seem? I mean, I love the phrase no-brainer. The arguments for this are incredibly compelling. What are its prospects for being enacted widely across the country with financial support from Congress in a way that would make this a meaningful, realistic possibility in time for November 2020?
Sure. Well, I don't think that it will be a nationwide phenomenon by November, and there's a few reasons for that. I mean, first and foremost, the system itself is fairly resistant to change, and what I mean by that is, you think about it, we're asking politicians who got elected in the current as-is model to change that model, right, that elected them. That's on both sides of the aisle. Elections have rarely been a priority at the congressional level or in most state houses across the country. They rarely get the priority that they deserve because the politicians that are there making those decisions got elected in the model that exists as it is. So there's sort of not a lot of energy to change that model. So that's kind of the first issue. The second issue is the general public and many of those same politicians don't recognize that there's a problem with the current system. So, there's such a lack of understanding of how things work now and the inefficiencies and the inequalities and the issues that we face and that we have faced, frankly, in every single election since Florida 2000, even after Congress enacted the Help America Vote Act, threw hundreds of millions of dollars at technology that didn't actually solve long lines problems and all of that exists over time. So we've never had a full conversation of what actually needs to happen. This is one example of a reform that needs to happen, but there's also other parts of the system that are effectively broken and need to change. And we write about that in our book. But even I want to put up a picture really quick from Wisconsin that I think shows clearly the issues that happened. This was a picture that was in the Wisconsin primary last week, and it effectively shows exactly what voter sentiments are around this issue. But this long line that you see is the same long line we saw in 2018 in New York City with close to 5-hour lines because of machine malfunctions. We saw 4-hour lines with people standing in line in Georgia during the early voting period. And we've seen these sorts of lines across the country. So this is not new, and this is not a result of the pandemic. This is the result of a system being very broken. And just to give an idea of the sort of other issues beyond just voting at home, I'll show this video really quick.
100 years ago, a movement that began in the Western United States culminated in women achieving the right to vote. But today, so many women still lack the opportunity to vote. Barriers such as restrictive voter registration processes and deadlines and inconvenient or non-existent voting options make the voting process difficult for many voters. These barriers prevent people from participating in our democracy. The 2016 presidential election and the 2018 midterm election saw record numbers of voters and turnout, but still only accounted for 61% and 49% of eligible voters in America. There's a lot more we can do to improve voter engagement. Solutions include providing more convenient options for voters, such as voting at home, early voting, automated and same-day registration, and primary reform. By empowering voters with more options, we can increase engagement and voter turnout. In fact, the states that have already implemented these policies are the states with the highest voter turnout in the nation. And when voter turnout increases, more women vote. And when more women vote, we get better representation in our government. And with better representation, we get better policies on issues like healthcare, education, and pay equity. But all of this will fail to happen unless we modernize our elections and the way we vote. Our election policies must put voters first and focus on who votes, not who wins. Let's build on what women fought for so bravely 100 years ago, because great things happen for everyone when all women vote.
so that is the premise of our book, and those are the things that we cover in our book. And it isn't just women. I mean, we interviewed women around the country because of the centennial, but it's really about improving democracy for every single voter, regardless of the circumstances that they may face, including potentially a pandemic or a public health crisis or another emergency situation. So that's really I think outlines not only the voting at home perspective, but also the effort to modernize registration and eliminate some of these barriers that exist in the process. And we're seeing, tremendous impacts on states that have not made these changes and have not updated their laws, in that they're trying to scramble to make this happen right now. And so I think it's, if states adopt good practices and talk to experts that have actually scaled these models and implemented these systems, and they replicate that, certainly more and more states can do it by November. But the clock is ticking, and political will and the financial aspect of things is really critical in making it happen.
Yeah.
Can I step in there, Ian, for a second?
Please.
So Amber is absolutely right. I think, we obviously have a big hill to climb here with regard to 2020 alone. And she's also obviously right that the broader voting and electoral infrastructure is broken in many ways. The United States has never put much of a priority on voting and on turnout for the reasons I mentioned earlier, which is that many people have been barred from voting for most of our, if not much of our nation's history. But I think one of the things that I think Wisconsin maybe taught us is that as bad as that was, and I think as sort of outrageous as what the Republican lawmakers in Wisconsin did was. I think it actually provided some good lessons, which is, first, it just showed what a disaster an election that doesn't have, good, access for people in a pandemic like this will look like. But it also illustrated that, people want to be involved, people want to vote, and you need to make voting available to them. And I think you actually see that at the level of elections officials from both parties around the country. I'm thrilled to know that, Amber, you were an election official yourself, so very intimately how sort of good faith a lot of people are on the ground. And I think once you get above that level to the politicians, and particularly to politicians in Washington and to President Trump himself, you get a lot of this sort of bad faith misdirection and sort of just lying about what mail voting is. But at the ground level, you see a lot of buy-in from both parties because they know that it actually works.
So I think one of the things that you're saying that Amber said makes a lot of sense. Listen, politicians aren't overly invested in changing the political system that elected them, right? So there's always that there's going to be a little bit of resistance there. But it does seem like there's a partisan dynamic. It does seem like when you look at Wisconsin,
of course,
right? So, let's really lean into that, though, because
okay.
I think it's also true that almost all of the states that have adopted a sort of mail-in vote scheme are Democratic-led.
Not Utah. Utah is.
With the exception of Utah. So, okay. Why is that? I mean, and Trump has come out and said, well, this isn't going to be good for Republicans. Is Trump an outlier? Is it that the other Republican officials are eager to do this, but he's the outlier?
No, Trump is the Republican id. I mean, Republicans have known for the last 40 or 50 years at least that when fewer people turn out to vote, they do better. Right. So it has been an article of faith in the GOP since at least the 1980s, probably going back to the 1970s, that let's keep turnout down and then we do better. And they're saying that openly now. Trump said it literally on Fox and Friends a few weeks ago. If you adopt all of these new measures to make voting easier, no Republican will ever get elected in America again. I mean, that's obviously an overstatement, but it reveals the mindset of Republicans today. And I think it's extremely harmful, obviously, to a representative democracy when one of the two major parties in the country doesn't want to make voting as easy as possible for everybody who wants to vote. I mean, that's just the essence of representative democracy is participation. So yes, absolutely, Republicans are the problem here. This shouldn't be a partisan issue, but it is right now. And I think, to the extent that Republicans can understand that they actually can benefit too from mail voting. Obviously, elderly Americans tend to lean to the right. So to the extent that those people are left out when mail voting is not available, that could really hurt Republicans too. And just the last point I would make is, I think Amber's absolutely right. This is a big lift for a lot of states, but let's not forget how many Americans currently vote by mail. In 2016, a quarter of all votes cast in the presidential election were cast absentee or by mail. So that's a lot of votes already. And I think there's room for scaling up, a reasonable room for scaling up around the country.
I want to ask Amber, same question. Jesse's actually used some pretty stark language saying, hey, Republicans as a whole are committed to suppressing the vote, understand themselves to be benefited when fewer people vote. Dates it back to 1980. I think there's sort of some classic quotes from then along those lines for the Reagan campaign. Do you agree with that analysis? Do you feel like that's a third rail, that if you're really going to win support for this, you can't frame it in partisan issues, in partisan terms? How do you think about it?
Yeah, well, I'll give a perspective that is first and foremost based on my experience as an election official. So first off, I'm unaffiliated. I have been my entire adult life, and I actually think that all election officials should be. So that's kind of point number one. We look at how Canada and other governments are structured in terms of who runs the elections. It is not partisan officials. And in our country, we're actually unique in that we introduce partisanship into this process. Second point I'll make is a lot of people think that the secretaries of state are the ones that run elections. They don't actually run the election. They oversee policies and they get involved in voter registration systems, but they're not the ones that are interacting with voters, that are running polling places, that are counting ballots and all that. So when you mentioned the congressional allocation of money, a lot of times that doesn't actually reach local election officials because it goes to the states, and those partisan officials that are in those offices don't necessarily pass that down to the local officials that actually run the process. So there's sort of two different, kind of issues there, but all relate to the fact that we have infused partisanship in the conduct of our elections. I generally think that's a whole nother issue that we need to address. I actually don't think that we should have, I don't think it should matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat in your qualifications to be Secretary of State. I think we need to pull some of those things out of our system right now and model more off of maybe what Canada does or what other systems are, in that they make elections more resilient to that partisanship and sort of game playing, if you will, with the rules of engagement. America's system has been fairly unique in terms of other democracies around the world, in that they have a lot of that infused partisan aspects that the two parties, one of the things that they usually agree on is that that they should be able to game the system, whether it's redistricting issues or campaign finance issues. I mean, I could go on and on, right? So I think that a lot of the reason that we haven't seen more changes in the election structure, funding of elections in a meaningful way, better ideas about how to provide access, is because there hasn't been technocrats, frankly, making those decisions at the policy level. It's been partisans that don't have any idea how an election runs. Right now, there's only 2 secretaries of state in the country that have actually run an election before. The rest of them are partisans looking to run for governor in a lot of states, and got a lot of examples of where that's happened. But that has, I think, created some of the issues that we face today in terms of what this looks like.
Super helpful. And again, yet another insight. I love the idea that there's an argument here for the whole electoral system to be structured in a way that elevates control to nonpartisan civil servants, to insulate from the political process. I would describe that as yet another no-brainer. I would describe eliminating the Electoral College as yet another no-brainer. Right? There's all of these incredible reforms that are out there. The arguments for them are well articulated. They seem clearly to advance the idea of representative democracy in which the greatest number of people participate and have a voice. Why aren't we enacting these things? and I want to come back. We could talk about any of them, but I want to come back. Maybe let's come back to this idea of voting from home. The people who oppose this, the people who say we should not do this, what are the sorts of arguments they make?
Yeah, well, I can speak to a few. I mean, I should have said this before. Nebraska and North Dakota have expanded voting at home quite significantly recently. They don't get talked about a lot, but actually they have a lot of counties now that mail out ballots to everyone. So there are examples where and I think more localized in terms of where the politics, if you will, or it being considered partisan one way or another, haven't reached the localities because it's been more about the election officials and what they've been advocating for. If you look across the spectrum, voting at home benefits every single voter, regardless of their party leanings or their partisanship, and it benefits and boosts turnout amongst all different demographics. Again, I think that the sort of resistance is resistance to change, the new, it being different. That is tends to be what we hear. I also hear from legislators in states that are frankly on the that have been controlled by one party, and that being the Democratic Party, whether it be Illinois or New York. New York still doesn't have, they just now got no excuse absentee, and they have no early voting. I mean, I use New York all the time as an example of a state that has less access for their voters than the state of Georgia, but who gets all the attention about voter suppression and all of that? It's Georgia, right? So we have various examples of that. Another state we worked in this year that I was surprised about getting reforms done was Maine. Maine has been controlled by one party for a long period of time. It's considered a blue state, and yet it was really hard for us to talk about voting at home and expanding those options. Illinois being another one where there's been a bit of a resistance to change. I think historical perspectives about voting in Chicago is a factor. I think that a resistance by politicians with power in terms of changing the way they got elected is another factor. Those things aren't specific necessarily to one side or the other. They come up from various politicians. Can
I step in here for a sec? I'm totally in sympathy with what you're trying to do, Amber, and I want you to succeed completely. But I just do want to push back a little on this is a Republican problem right now. I understand what you're saying about Democrats in some places being a little resistant to change. I would point out that Mainers have also adopted ranked choice voting to an extent that nowhere else in the country has, and that's certainly a very significant change. I would say even probably more of a different way of voting than voting by mail as opposed to showing up at the polls. So I do think this is a problem that is coming from one side of the aisle right now, and we know why it's coming from that side of the aisle. And I think it's just all a smokescreen. I mean, if there's any doubt about that, President Trump himself has been voting by mail for years. And when he was challenged on that in a press conference in the White House, the reporter said to him, "Well, how do you reconcile the fact that you vote by mail and yet you say other people shouldn't?" He said, "Well, because I'm allowed to." And I thought, yeah, that's the whole point. Everyone should be allowed to, because clearly if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for everybody else. And it's just outrageous that anybody, especially though the President of the United States, who in theory anyway represents the entire country, all people equally, is promoting something that would drive down voting all over the country. So I know we need to get this done nationwide. I know we need to appeal to Republicans as well as Democrats, but as I said, 25% of Americans voted by mail in 2016. There were all millions and millions of Republicans doing it just alongside millions and millions of Democrats. This is not a partisan thing. And, the fact that a Democratic candidate won in Wisconsin, despite all predictions, I don't think should distract us from the core issue, which is the access to the ballot. As your video very, I think, rightly emphasized, it's not about who wins, it's about who votes. Right. Yep. And that's really the key here. So, the fact that the Democrat won, fine. I mean, maybe for all we know, the Republicans plan to keep voters, away, blew up in their faces because elderly voters who would have supported the Republican didn't vote at all because they didn't go out to the polls for very obvious reasons. I think if we're going to if we're going to, get through this, we need to confront the reality that it's really one party that's driving all of the opposition right now, or the vast majority of the opposition.
Yeah, and I agree with that. In fact, I think I've had to answer questions about President Trump's comments at least on 50 different press calls over the last week and a half, and it infuriates me because when you look at him and you look at FLOTUS and the VP and many of the cabinet and most of the Senate, they all vote by mail. And so to me, if the political class has access, everyone else should have that same access. And so, yes, I think we have to call a spade a spade. And I don't disagree. I just sort of was laying out that there's been opposition along the way from various.
Not to mention that both the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court, in making it harder for Wisconsinites to vote last week, voted themselves remotely. It's just, I mean, the hypocrisy is really just, it would be breathtaking if we didn't see it every day.
Right.
Well, it's still breathtaking, and that's why we're hyperventilating. Let me come in here, and I don't know if this is exercising the moderator's prerogative, because what I'm doing is taking off my moderator's hat and offering a different perspective. But my own expertise has to do with the way in which race has been weaponized in our political system, and I think it really connects up to the question of voter suppression or a resistance to reforms that would enhance representative democracy, and it connects up in a particular way. We have a deep opposition to empowering voters that is expressed through the language of corruption and fraud. If we allow voting by mail, that's going to lead to fraud. We need to use voter ID because otherwise that's going to lead to voter impersonation and fraud. The fraud idea has been repeatedly debunked on a factual basis, and yet, right, because there's virtually no fraud at all at this level. Indeed, if you're worried about the integrity of the election, then you should be funding efforts to suppress voter tampering of the sort of electoral manipulation of the sort done by Russia, hardening up our machines and all of that. But that's not happening. We're having this conversation about fraud. We try and tamp down on the fraud argument by saying there's no evidence that this occurs on more than an infinitesimal basis, and yet we can't get the needed reforms enacted. And my own sense is underlying the narrative of fraud is a racial story. It's a story about racial groups being locked into conflict, the parties representing different racial teams, and a sense of threat that other people who do not deserve to vote and do not deserve to vote because of their racial identity, or in a closely related term, because of their immigration status, are seeking to exercise rights of democratic rights that they do not deserve on a real level. They might deserve it on a technical level. But they don't deserve it on a real practical level, to be electors, to be engaged in self-government along with some of us. And again, this is a very racialized conversation. And I want to just throw that out there as a sort of hey, here's my perspective now. Care to respond? Does that resonate? Does that not seem right?
I think there's no question that's right. The entire history of this country and of democracy in this country is racialized, right? It's no accident that the people who are almost always harmed first or most by these voting restrictions are people of color, minorities, voters who are vulnerable, to such restrictions. I just think, the Electoral College has the same quality to it, right? So you can go back to the founding and you see that it was slave states who posed one of the obstacles to a national popular vote, as James Madison said quite openly during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, because they knew that all of their slaves who couldn't vote that would reduce their power in a popular vote election. And that's why we ended up in part with the Electoral College. You see it in even as late as 1969 and 1970, an effort in Congress came closer than any other in American history to abolishing the Electoral College in favor of the national popular vote. Who blocked it? it was led by a filibuster in the Senate by 3 Southern segregationists, led by Strom Thurmond. They know which side their bread is buttered on. This is really central to the story of America. And I think, even just the debate we have today about big cities, one of the questions I get on the Electoral College and what would happen if we switched to a national popular vote is, wouldn't big cities would just dominate the vote? And I think, for a lot of people in this country, big cities is a euphemism for people of color, minorities generally. It's sort of akin to the coastal liberals would dominate the election. First of all, it's just factually untrue in terms of numbers, but I think that's really what's hiding behind those expressions in a lot of cases. Maybe people don't even realize they're doing it, but saying big cities, I think, has very, very traditionally been a proxy for dark-skinned people. So I absolutely agree, and we see it with mail voting. We saw it with mail voting in Wisconsin last week, that the people who were hurt most were minorities, the overwhelming majority of whom live in Milwaukee, which had to scale back, I think, 97% of its precincts or polling places. All of this is just to say that I agree completely that race is at the center of all of this.
I would say that, I think as Jesse pointed out, the history of our country suggests that there's always been attempts to leave people out. And we see that in the policy front. We see that, with going back to women's suffrage. And, I even think about now with regards to primary reform, for instance, that a lot of us have worked on, independents are getting left out for elections that they pay for, right? So it almost seems to me that it's been, in a lot of ways, the powers that be, right? And that's sort of, we've had that kind of flipping back and forth a little bit. But the powers that be, whether it's guided by the one particular party or another, they have operated in a way to leave people out. I talk about registration deadlines. Like, that was not put in place to benefit voters. That was put in place so that candidates and campaigns on both sides of the aisle would know who their electorate was, and they could go knock on the doors. They wanted their precinct lists. It was designed for party and political structures to know those folks, hand their precinct captains lists that they could go knock on the door and figure that out. It was never designed for voters. And so, who does a 30-day registration deadline hurt? Well, it hurts younger people that are moving more often. It hurts inner cities that have 10 to 15% move rates in a month. It hurts, as Jesse pointed out, people where they live in those areas, and that is minority voters in various parts of the country. That's who gets hurt by things like 30-day registration deadlines or ineffective policies with this sort of assigning people to a polling place mentality. I think about that all the time. You look at who lives an hour away from their jobs or their work, and can they actually get home to vote in time? The answer is no. And when you look at who those people are, it is by design, right? Who lives near their polling places? Well, suburban America, where they're home by a certain time once they pick up their kids and they're close to that polling place. That's not the case for a lot of people that work. And I think the other thing that I would add is, 50 years ago, we didn't have as many dual income households that we do today. And, single moms that are working multiple jobs or going to school at night while working and all of that, the likelihood that they make it to a polling place on the day of in Missouri, where you can't vote early and you can't get an absentee ballot, if, being a single mom is not a way to get an absentee ballot, it's nil, and they're not going to show up and they're not going to vote. And we have data that shows all of these impacts. And, again, I think any politician that doesn't want to make this process more accessible for every single elector for selfish reasons should not be elected in this country.
And I'll just say that, going back to something Amber said a few minutes ago, pointing out sort of New York's failures on the electoral reform front, I absolutely agree. I mean, we've editorialized repeatedly on how bad New York is on so many issues relating to voting access, early voting in particular, and registration restrictions. And that's something that, has slowly been changing, but it's as she says, it's the problem is with incumbency comes a lot of protectiveness about the systems that got people into power in the first place. But this really is about race in so many ways. There's a reason that we have a 24th Amendment, which bars poll taxes, which were aimed directly at Black voters, right, who had been newly enfranchised, right. That practice popped up soon after the previous, but the 13th Amendment made, and the 14th Amendment made Black voters, made Black people not slaves anymore and gave them citizenship and the right to vote. So, this is just threaded through our national history, and it's literally written down in our Constitution, the degree to which we have had to, dramatically reform our national charter just to say you can't discriminate against Black people. So I think we're seeing that carrying through today. Yes, the party's names change, but really it's conservatism and the resistance to expanding the electorate in a way that I think really befits a modern, representative democracy. That's the problem.
Yeah, so I want to clarify two different arguments that are being made here, and then I'm going to ask you both if out of the histories that you've studied, there are lessons for the moment. But to clarify, one point is that efforts to suppress the vote very often target people of color. Though we should be clear that that it expands into an effort to disenfranchise not just people of color, but working families generally, right? So one way to look at race in the election is to say Republicans strategize to make it more difficult for this set of people to vote, and then to ask about why that is and whatnot. That's one comment. Here's the other comment, though. Race is not just playing out in terms of who's being disenfranchised. It's playing out in terms of the rationale that is being offered offered people to support politicians who themselves are busy undermining democracy. I think most voters understand that they're electing a set of politicians who, when they oppose voting by mail, when they impose voter ID laws, when they close polling places, are actually pushing back against democracy. And it's important to understand that the story that people are being told is they need to make a choice between whether they, as part of a large racial group, will be protected, or whether instead democracy will be fully empowered. Right? So race is operating here not just in the groups that are targeted, but in the stories we tell about why democracy is a threat. All right, I wanted to get that out. If that's the problem we face, then that's the problem we've faced for the last 200 years in terms of race, up through the 19th Amendment in terms of gender. Are there lessons from the past? Are there lessons from the suffragist movement? Are there lessons from the fight for the Voting Rights Act that we can import to the present? What do you think, Amber? You invoke the early women's fight for the right to vote?
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of present day relevance for that particular movement, but many of the movements that have enfranchised voters that have been left out. And when I go back to when you look at sort of where that movement started, it got its steam in Western states where Wyoming was, sort of the first. Colorado was the first to pass it with a citizens initiative because our legislature rejected it, and so they went to the citizens. And even when you look at how the campaign was structured, basically women had to convince men that they would still have dinner ready at home on the table, even if they got the right to vote, right? So we look at a lot of that relevance today. It's I feel like we end up always making the case that, well, it won't hurt you, even though you don't want these people to vote. And that kind of goes to the whole hypocrisy of the president saying that, it's okay for him, but it's not okay for everybody else. I feel like we're always constantly trying to convince the people that are saying no on how it benefits them. And I feel, I think that a lot of our, the reforms that have happened, whether it's women's suffrage or not, we've had to convince those that have held the power to make change in that way. And the only other thing I would say is, I think that our present day issues with getting change made, whether it's the Electoral College or voting at home or other registration related matters, when we look at the money in politics and sort of how that has completely diminished voters' ability and sort of direct democracy overall, I can point to one example that has happened with the stimulus. I've spent weeks trying to convince everybody that we can that our elections across the country need an infusion of $1 to $1.5 billion just to scale vote at home. And Boeing got a $17 billion bailout because they spend $2 million or so in the last year on lobbyists at the federal level. Well, that was passed not only in the Senate, but also in the House, right? And so if Boeing can get $17 billion, but we can't get $1 billion or less without a huge, massive fight to support every voter in the country, we've got a problem, right? And so I think and it's all intertwined in a lot of ways with the entire issue of race, of voting access, of all these things that we've had happen over time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But Jesse, lessons from the past?
Well, first, I just want to say I completely agree with Amber, and it really is infuriating the way Congress has dealt with this, and that Democrats haven't pushed even harder on this particular issue of basic, protection of democracy. I think the first or the second, whichever stimulus package included the money for vote by mail expansion, included $400 million, right? I would say the number is even higher than Amber says. The estimate by the Brennan Center for Justice, which has been sort of tracking this for a while, is probably needing $4 billion by the end to include all the elections that the states are having to run now, primaries and other elections in advance of the November election. Even $4 billion, which is 10 times what they have allocated so far, is not even a drop in the bucket. It's a speck in the bucket. It was near that stimulus package was $2 trillion. This is a rounding error, and the fact that they still won't allocate that money for the most basic protection of democracy is really just it's evidence of the nation's long time neglect of its founding principles and its founding values. But when it comes to those historical values and principles, I do think it's important to remember that there have been people from the beginning who have understood the promise of America as a place that is inclusive, that is egalitarian fundamentally, that is an expansive representative democracy. That was the whole idea, right, of building a United States and drafting the Constitution. And one of the characters in my book, Let the People Pick the President, is James Wilson, who is one of the most important framers that you've never heard of. He was a Scottish immigrant. He came over in his 20s and very quickly rose to become one of the most prominent lawyers in the country. He signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, one of only 6 founders to do so. And Wilson himself, to me, he's a big part of my story because he was the biggest advocate at the Constitutional Convention for a popular vote for president. But he had a more general sort of modern democratic notion, small d, obviously, in which he thought of a new representative democracy as being something that was fundamentally about people and not states. So he says, I have this quote in the middle of the convention in July. He says, the majority of people, wherever found, ought in all questions to govern the minority. And I think that sort of very, very simple invocation of the idea of majority rule, it goes right back to the founding era. These weren't all men who were terrified of democracy, as I think the story often goes. There were a number of them, including the most influential of all, who really saw the promise in an expansive representative democracy. And I think that everything you say and everything that Amber said about all the fits and starts we've had along the way are absolutely true. But it's important for us to remember that these threads and these values have really been there from the start and have never gone away. And the arguments in favor of equality have always won the day, or almost always won the day in the end. And even though there's always going to be groups who see it as in their interest, it's advantageous to them to suppress the votes, to keep the electorate smaller, I think that in the end, the majority of Americans do see these values as being central to the nation that we live in.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, and I want to try and combine elements of both what you've said, Jesse, and what Amber said. I think, Jesse, in terms of what you're putting on the table here is, in some ways, we're making a revolutionary demand, but the revolution is the American Revolution. It's not some revolution that's completely disconnected to where we are, something new, something different, something we haven't seen. A lot of people are saying we need to honor the values of the American Revolution. We need to understand what those are and and the background against which they arose. And I think it's so important to think about the American Revolution as one more step in the effort of human society to respond to the problem in which wealth and power tends to concentrate in the hands of the few, who then organize society and politics and even religion around defending the wealth and power of the few. And the Democratic response to that was to say, let us empower the many by enfranchising the many to make sure that wealth and power are distributed downward and outward to as many as possible. And against that impulse, you've always had the sense of, okay, but not that group and not that group. And to the extent that the populace has accepted the argument that some groups are undeserving of political power, some undeserving of economic, the ability to participate fully and freely and equally in the marketplace, we've actually all lost. And that's where I want to come back and pick up a point that, Amber, you brought in, that we should have brought in maybe at the outset, and that is to talk about billions, to talk about corporations, to put it in more dramatic language, to talk about class war. We don't tend to use that phrase, but this has always been about class war. Democracy has been about class war, and it's been a response to it. And the response to it is, let us figure out a democratic system, a political system, a market system that favors the many against the few. And what we're seeing right now is that over the last 50 years, we've lost tremendous ground, and that our political system, which favors the many, let's say at the sort of the high point of the New Deal and Great Society, has been re-engineered increasingly to favor the few, the Boeings, the Koch brothers, but in a way that makes it very hard for us to restructure the system to actually distribute power back to all of us. And the thing that I would then insert is, this is the work that race is doing. Race isn't simply about hostility towards people of color. It's about promoting an orientation toward politics and government in which people are encouraged to focus on racial division in a process in which they're actually supporting a class war that the rich are winning, right? And the reason this is so important is because it connects up, Amber, to a point that you made that I think is really important. How do you convince people to change? You need to convince people who think they're helped by the current system, that in fact they're being harmed by the current system. In fact, just about all of us, except for the very, very wealthy, have a stake in making sure that democracy expands, that everybody of every racial group is able to participate. That making sure that people of different racial groups vote is not about redistributing power among racial groups. It's about redistributing power to all of us, reclaiming it, taking it back from the very pinnacle, which is where it resides now. So I'm going to treat that as my closing words. We're getting to the near the end of this incredible session. I've really been grateful to be joined by Jesse Wegman and Amber McReynolds, and I'm going to give each of them a couple of minutes to say their last closing remarks. Amber, let me see. Actually, I'm going to go with Jesse first, and Amber, we'll close with you again. Jesse, please.
You know, Ian, I think that's a wonderful framing for the bigger picture here. And I if you forgive me one more reference to my book, I really think that your this expression of the idea that the way that you promote change is to convince people that systems that they think are helping them are actually hurting them. That's a really big part of the debate over the Electoral College as well. I think there's so many myths or misconceptions out there about how the Electoral College functions to help or hurt certain people or certain groups or certain regions of the country, and they really need to be debunked. And that's one of the things that I do in my book. So, for example, one of the most common ones is, the small states will be hurt by it, or the rural states. People conflate small and rural, but in fact, there are huge rural parts of California and huge rural parts of New York too. And if you think those voters are lean to the right, lean to Republicans, those voters are erased under the Electoral College right now, because those states give all of their electors to the Democrat. So I think that when you can explain to people and try to get them to get away from those sort of baked in ideas based on nothing but just stories that have been passed down or prejudices or whatever, and say, in fact, you are being harmed. You are being ignored right now. If you live in a small state, if you live in any state that's not a battleground state, for example, for the Electoral College, if you live in any state that's not a battleground state, which is around 40 or 45 every year, you are basically ignored by both parties, and your issues don't matter to the candidates of either party. I think when you can make that case, and that's what I hope the book can do more with more people, you do start to generate the seeds for reform on a broader scale. And I think with voting by mail, it's the same thing. And I'll let Amber sort of articulate that a little more. But I see voting by mail as really just such a natural part of voting for all people in America, as we say, in a pandemic more than ever. But even once we're past this, it's going to be a way that I think more and more people turn to express their political voice and to be heard in this country.
Amber, closing thoughts.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. And I've really enjoyed the conversation with Jesse and appreciate and support his work in the new book. I think I can't wait to read it. First and foremost, I think, my entire career has been about trying to serve voters and improve the voting experience, put voters first. And I mean that when I say that we have to change our way of thinking about election policies and reform and put voters at the center and the front of those discussions and avoid falling into what benefits one side or the other, because we've had historically, that's really where the conversation has gone, and that's why we are faced with the reality today that half of the country chose not to participate in 2018 in what was considered to be a record year. My book, When Women Vote, what we've tried to do is highlight the need for election reform to enfranchise all voters more effectively in the system, provide more convenient options, not only because it's healthy for our democracy, but we also have evidence that more women get elected to vote, more women of color and from various demographics also get elected to vote. When we look at even just those states with the highest percentage of women in the legislatures, they're all Western. Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and Nevada are all part of that. And they have the most women elected in their state legislative bodies. And they also consistently have more votes cast before Election Day, which sort of ties in with the money in politics thing, but also it speaks to the advantages that voting by mail has in terms of down ballot turnout. So you have more time at home to go farther down the ballot. You're going to see a higher turnout amongst those local and more state-based races. But we still have a lot of work to do. I'm from a state that's considered progressive, but we've never chosen a woman to be the mayor of Denver, a governor of Colorado, or a woman senator from the state of Colorado. And that is still in a lot of places around the country. So there's a lot of work to do to enfranchise the populace, make it easier for voters to engage with their democracy, and frankly, improve confidence in government, which, if you look, the first interaction that most people have with their government and who they choose to be elected is at the voting booth and in the voting process. And if that entails them waiting in line for 4 hours, their confidence in government generally diminishes. And so that's really why I think we have to do a better job of serving our voters more effectively, which again does benefit everyone across the political spectrum because it increases that confidence generally in government.
This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you, Amber McReynolds. Thank you, Jesse Wegman. Thank you all for joining us for this Bay Area Book Festival Unbound. Please be sure to check the link associated with this. where you'll find links to Jesse's book, Let the People Pick the President, Amber's book, When Women Vote, and my own book, Merge Left. Thank you again. We're unbound.